Thanks very much, Launchpad, for having me here today and talking about a very important topic, which is cybersecurity. I also would like to echo John's thoughts about being on the traditional land of our traditional custodians and pay my respects to elders past and present as well. I was just walking around this morning, and of course, being a Launchpad, one of the main roles and functions that you guys have is about entrepreneurship and startups. So I've got quite a boring presentation with a couple of slides, but I just want to bring out a couple of themes today of entrepreneurship and also competitive advantage, because competitive advantage is about how you can grow your business, not only from a state government point of view, but also your own. So there's a couple of themes that I want to come back to. So entrepreneurship, competitive advantage, and also want to touch today on skills, because skills is really important and also somewhere that the government definitely wants to head to as well. So I've got the first slide, and I've been doing this role for about 18 months, and it's been a fantastic journey. I'm a little bit worried because the next speaker actually really knows what cybersecurity is, Professor Alana. But I want to tell you what I think cybersecurity is from a user point of view and maybe from a quasi-government point of view. Now, when I got this job, one of our offices, it's at University of New South Wales, and we're in the computer science building, and you can do a degree in cybersecurity through computer science. Not long after that, I got asked by the Australian Human Rights Institute to come and meet with them about cybersecurity. And they said, human rights is all about cybersecurity. And I was thinking to myself, sure, can you explain that a little bit more? Their perspective was that human rights, or international human trafficking, identity fraud and identity theft, is all about cybersecurity. So you can do a degree in law in cybersecurity. Now, the other degree that you can do, this is generally from universities, is in management. You can do a cyber degree through management of cybersecurity. So I'm thinking to myself, gee whiz, we've got these pockets of expertise, but in different disciplines. It's all cyber. It's all about data and keeping it safe, but coming from different perspectives. So one of the first things I wanted to touch on and share my learnings is cyber is very nebulous. It means different things to different people. But depending on where you are and what applications you need, you can use these different skill sets. So most definitely, cybersecurity in its most traditional view is a technical computer application through computer science. But it also has law, management and psychology most definitely within that. And Alana can talk at much more detail about that. So one of the learnings for me is, what is cyber? Well, cyber is everywhere. And the other thing is that I think is very important right up front. Cyber just isn't about risk mitigation. And as you're panicking and we're going to get attacked and we've got to do these risk mitigation exercises in cyber. Cyber's a good thing. If you have cyber in your organisation, not just in the IT department as a vertical, but as a horizontal, it can allow you to make better decisions. And if you make better decisions with data, you can make better decisions on how your business is going to go. You can use data from global trends, from sales, from machining, and not just your financial data, which is quite historical. So when you look at businesses that have cyber or data analytics right across the organisation, you tend to see successful businesses. So that's my perspective. I want to be a bit provocative today and just share some of the thoughts that I have about cyber. But when you're in your startup or you're in your organisation and people talk about just an IT application for cyber, I'd invite you to think more differently about that. Cyber security, about keeping data safe, is everyone's responsibility. It's not just the IT guys. So cyber is a people problem. It's also technical, but most of the time it's people. 70% of issues with cyber come from people. People doing silly stuff, clicking on an email that they shouldn't, and going from there. So really, in your organisation, or if you've got a startup and you're looking for somewhere of how you're going to solve something, people need to be front and centre. I was talking with the Australian Signals Directorate the other day. That's the federal government inwardly focused, they're the spy agency really. They're doing a program of one of the key risks to Australia, and that's executive assistants. Because executive assistants, one of their KPIs is they need to work out who's contacting the organisation or their boss about things. Thanks, Rebecca. So they're going to do a program specifically for executive assistants about emails and knowing which ones to click on. That actually is a really good cybersecurity strategy. So I just wanted to share my what is cybersecurity slide. It's different, it's very, very broad, and it's not always just a bad thing. It's actually an enabler. And I touched on it can be an accelerator to your business. When you have a look at really successful businesses that are doing things differently, and this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, you can use data differently in your business, and it can really be an accelerator or an enabler. It really pains me when businesses just look at traditional views, and when we go into the next few slides about skills, how do you get the right people to make your business better? Well, I'm not sure if those jobs of the future or the jobs that are here currently actually have been created well, or our institutions are delivering against that. So please keep an open eye to what is cybersecurity. This is one of my favourite slides because you can never really tell what's on it, but I found it a couple of months ago. This is a cyber slide, obviously, and what I like about it is you don't have to look too hard, but it links everything together. And just to reiterate my point before about where cyber sits and the importance of cybersecurity, here are very traditional jobs and some quite new ones, but how they interrelate to everything. So say, for example, you're in water. Water's been around for a very long time, or if you're in the Department of Water, you must now, in this age, be able to work in where cyber fits. You also need to work out your data science, how it relates to smart cities. So as things evolve in an interconnected world, I just don't think that it's good enough to be very stereotypical in your job anymore. You need to have skills outside of and be trained up, especially for data science. I'm happy to share that because it is a hard one to read. But I think it's a really important one just to make sure that everyone knows where you sit and the skills that you need. Just want to touch on people and process. Everyone talks about this in presentations, but just to go to the point again about people as a cyber problem, you can really mitigate a lot of cyber risk if you have some basic people and process systems in your organisation. I did a presentation probably 2 months ago to New South Wales Business Chamber. There was about 80 people in the audience. And has anyone heard of the Essential 8 from the Australian Signals Directorate? No? There's a few people saying no. So the Australian Signals Directorate Top 8 really, from a basic level business point of view, is 8 simple, easily to implement items that you can do within your business that take a lot of the risk away from cybersecurity threats and breaches. If you haven't heard of that, please get your head around it. And as a startup or a business that's looking to grow, you can easily mitigate against some cybersecurity threats if you follow these 8 steps. And I'm always a bit surprised that a lot of people haven't heard of it. I think that's a government thing, needs to do a bit better for communicating about what to do. So we'll go into what the Essential 8 is. My favourite one is having someone in the organisation that's responsible for changing passwords. If you did that, you're going to go a long way to being a little bit more cyber secure. I won't read all of those out because it's up to you guys to implement or take the ones that you want for your businesses. I'm happy to share this presentation at a later date as well if you don't want to take a photograph of it. So, cybersecurity, I just want to talk about entrepreneurship in cyber for a moment. My cousin is a dairy farmer down at Bega, and he's part of the Bega Cooperative, and he uses sensors on his farm to measure and get efficiencies in his business, for example, herd maximisation. I've learnt that if you feed cows one type of product, they produce X amount of milk, and if you feed them a different type, you get Y amount. It's not world-beating stuff, but you learn and you get data from it. So he's now got sensors on his, about the soil density. He's got sensors on his dams, and he's actually using Internet of Things on his farm to make his farm smarter, produce more, be more environmentally friendly. And he's also gone into edge computing in some of the applications and some of the animals that he has on his farm as well. So he said to me the other day, I'm actually doing food security. That's one of the things that I need to be aware of. But I just wanted to tell that story because Tim, my cousin, who's a dairy farmer, I say he's a dairy farmer, he says he's in national food security, you know? It's true. So just back to what your business ideas are and what the skills are that you need to be successful. Tim's my cousin, so I can say this, he's not the smartest tool in the shed, but he's smart enough to take things that don't necessarily go together to make a business out of it. So now he's getting consulting work from other farm tech about how to make their farms produce more. I mean, it's pretty simple stuff. So that's one of the examples I wanted to share today with your startups or opportunities into the future. It's not linear anymore, I think, businesses. So Tim, being in national food security, I think it's a good example about how he has had to learn cybersecurity and the opportunities as an enabler that come with that. I'm sorry I've put this in and the font's all different, but one of the things I wanted to talk today specifically in Western Sydney about is competitive advantage. This is something very close to my heart with cyber. It's just not good enough, I don't think, anymore to say our cyber's better than your cyber, or you know, our state's better than your state, or my business is better than your business. From my experience, and I think from a government perspective, what everyone's after is high value-added jobs. You want a job that you get paid a significant amount of money for, and you can employ people on a good wage. And in an interconnected world, that's becoming harder and harder. So this brings us back to what have you got competitive advantage in? So from a cybersecurity perspective, you look around Australia and also internationally and see where is it that New South Wales can differentiate itself on and actually grow high value added jobs. That's really the holy grail for government and policy, and also providing the framework for businesses in New South Wales. So the first one, this is for your consideration. The first one is that New South Wales, specifically Sydney, is the fintech capital of probably the Southern Hemisphere. We've got more fintech startups here and fintech applications than anywhere else. By the way, one of my jobs, and I'm not sure if I'm doing a good job, is to tell the narrative about this. New South Wales is the best when it comes to these 5 things. So I just wanted to flag that. Put in there, if you're not doing any fintech applications, you know, the ecosystem out there is really thriving. It's going to be a little bit easier for you to do something in that space. The second one, and I know that Minister Dominello has been fantastic on this, New South Wales is a leader in digitalisation, open source data. If you and your business or your startup can leverage open source data, you might be able to employ more people and make better decisions. So New South Wales is a digital state, increasingly so. So digitalisation is very, very important. The third one is very important, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, is cyber workforce. I know Alana will have some thoughts on this, but what are the skills that's needed for cyber? And I don't want to pick on Tim too much. He hasn't got any qualifications for cyber. He's just learnt. I know he has gone to TAFE for a little bit as well down in Bega. But what is it that you need to put the afterburners on? But I do believe in New South Wales there's a number of great ways that we're skilling the workforce. World-leading research from universities. TAFE, Vocational Education, has got a certificate for cyber security. And there's some other initiatives that we're going to come out with soon or underway. And one I'd like to talk about is a program called CyberSTEM that we're running. CyberSTEM is about interconnected machines, and cyber is keeping them protected. And we're joining up high schools and providing infrastructure to high schools to get kids involved, and specifically females. We're up to 69 schools around the state, linking with vocational education training. We've got an MOU with TAFE New South Wales, and hopefully leveraging those numbers into our 8 university members. And that program's working very, very well at the moment. And depending on what level the business is up to, you might want to get someone straight from school to come and help you with your business. You might want a TAFE person, or you might want to get someone from university with a whole different skill set. So we're just trying to do a talent pipeline in a bit of a different way for businesses to tap into in New South Wales. If you want some more details, please let me know. There's some other exciting things in this space that we've been working on, which is a apprenticeship in STEM, or a cybership, we're going to call it, an apprenticeship in cyber. So there's some other opportunities for you to get skills at whatever level you need coming up in the next few months. Industry 4.0. This kills me because I was having a chat this morning, and especially in Western Sydney, with how many manufacturing businesses you have out here. I come from the Hunter Valley. We've got heaps of manufacturing businesses up there as well. We've stopped talking about it, I think, and I was impressed that Premier Berejiklian, when she was over in Germany, said that New South Wales is an advanced manufacturing area. I thought that was great. So I think what we can do better, and especially you guys in Western Sydney, is to say that's actually a competitive advantage, specifically for us out here. 8,000 manufacturers I think you guys have got, and the application specifically Industry 4.0. I think you are a leader now. I think you can really drive that home, and if you're looking to set up a business or grow, well, Western Sydney would be the place where you need to come. Not for the advanced manufacturing, but the wider applications of Industry 4.0. I think when we talk about New South Wales and where you want to set up and grow a business, advanced manufacturing and Industry 4.0 is exactly the thing that we need to be talking about. I've put some examples on there. Our Premier's talking about it. Advanced manufacturing obviously is happening now. Aerotropolis, everyone knows about that, surely, and here in Western Sydney. I've put in there AgTech. I'm harping on Tim this morning, but agriculture and the applications of that is huge, and there's also applications for medtech, a lot of different types of tech. So Industry 4.0, there's one thing you can take away today. I think all go out and start talking about Western Sydney or New South Wales as Industry 4.0 leader. I think that'd be really bloody helpful. So I'd invite everyone to do that. Now the fifth one, R&D. Now, our universities in New South Wales are world leading in this area. It's been proven time and time again, and I'm sure Alana will talk to this, but I've been really impressed with the innovative approach that universities have been taking in this. And I know that Western Sydney is doing some amazing work in trust and governance, where they're linking the computer science with the psychology area to come up with a whole new area of research and applicability to business. And again, I really like that story because it's taking different mindsets or different areas and putting them together and coming up with something different and tying back into competitive advantages. If you want to know about, if no one trusts you with your data, they're not going to buy your product. Trust is the number one thing for cyber. And we've got world-leading capability here in New South Wales. So they're my top 5 New South Wales cyber competitive advantages. I'm not sure if I'm entirely right. I'm pretty sure I'm not entirely wrong, but I think the narrative that we can start talking about is how you can use these things to make your business better. I'm very sure that the skills needed for the future we have in New South Wales and look more differently at that. So that's my competitive advantage slide as well. Just want to talk, before I finish up, about skills. This is really important because I know Alana's got some different thoughts on this. Whether or not it's 18,000 or it's 8,000 or it's 800, there is some sort of gap between what jobs or businesses are after versus what's being produced currently. Now, depending on what metric you want to use, there's an opportunity there to do things a little bit differently. And probably one of the examples that I want to give is Hewlett-Packard Enterprises. That's the innovation area for Hewlett-Packard. They only employ people from TAFE, I learnt the other day. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it's obviously the area that they've been able to get people from. So I'm thinking to myself, is there an opportunity to put different things together if you need those skills in your business, and especially link between VET and university? So I think from a state government point of view, we're really keen to try and leverage our competitive advantages. I think it's important for people to start talking about what we actually really are best at, and it pains me that Victoria says that they're best at cyber all the time. I think they're good at saying that they're their best and not actually having much to back it up. They are pretty good. But also from South Australia has done a very good job at growing an industry around new economic opportunity. For example, they've just said that they're a defence state, and now they're winning a lot of defence contracts. Now they've claimed space, which I was very surprised about. They'll have contracts around this. And I fully respect that. I think we can do a bit better in New South Wales for that. And hence again, I'll go back to the competitive advantage slide. But South Australia has done a good job at growing industries. It's like a moonshot with innovation. Put a stake in the ground and grow an industry around it. I think South Australia's done great. In New South Wales, we've been resting on our laurels a little bit. It's a competitive marketplace out there. I just think that cyber, the applicability to everyone and everything is there. If we can be really pointed about how you can actually use that with competitive advantage and engaging differently to get the skills, I think that'd be really, really great. So I think that's the end of my presentation.
Just come back from 10 days in Silicon Valley to an industry conference called SUPS and USENIX, and it's a conference that Google and Facebook fund quite heavily in the area of usable security and privacy. Now, it's always interesting when you go to Silicon Valley for the following reasons. Now, how many of you are involved in a startup? And how many of you think I actually have to go there if I'm in a tech startup in order to get funding? Does that cross your mind sometimes? Yeah, so it was really interesting to be there because there's a different mentality and a different way of thinking about a lot of different things, including cybersecurity. One of the reasons why Google and Facebook and Intel fund usable security and privacy so much is because it's the area that they understand the least. And I'm going to talk a lot about that today. Now, part of being in Australia, I've lived in a lot of different parts of the world. We've been here now for about 9 years, and I've been at Western Sydney University for 1 year, is that sometimes we feel, or I do, that I'm far away from where the action's at. So it's hard to keep on top of my discipline in my field, and I don't know if some of you feel the same way. But I had a wonderful thing happen to me 10 days ago when we were in Silicon Valley. We did 2 presentations, one based on some current research and the other one based on an idea, and we won prizes for both. So here's the advantage of sometimes being far removed from the scene. You're not infiltrated with the same kind of thinking, right? Because I haven't been at the 6,000 seminars being produced in Washington, D.C., in Silicon Valley, and over in Germany and London. So I've thought about the problem from a different perspective. And so for me, that was really refreshing to see. And what I want you to always think about is that in Australia, there are advantages of being removed, right? So I want to just talk a little bit about my background because it's particularly strange. Someone asked me how I got into cybersecurity, and I would say fate in some ways. So I started off with a university degree which could best be described in communications, but I did a lot of computer science within that. I went to law school of all things, discovered I never wanted to be a lawyer, and I ended up doing rather quickly a lot of policy work for governments in the field of anything to do with the computer and the law, because I'm old, and at the time there was no one else that knew how to do that very well. So I got to sit on some of the highest level of briefing with the Canadian government, working on projects that I would only dream of if I were to enter that phase now, because there would be probably 400 applicants with the same qualifications. So I went and I've studied and worked in practice, and I've taught in psychology, medicine, computer science, law, business, criminology, social sciences, political science. I've done a little bit of lecturing across everything. So I describe myself as GOO. I'm literally the person who knows a little bit about all the disciplines and how they might relate to cybersecurity, and I bring the GOO together to try and solve hard problems. So Todd gave you a slide earlier, and it showed cybersecurity, that wheel that he said you probably couldn't see. And I was counting how many projects we either have or proposals we have at the moment, and he had something near about 38 different areas around that wheel, and I've got projects in 17 of those areas around cybersecurity, because cybersecurity permeates everything. Before we go further, I need to explain just a couple of things about my background. I'm mindful that I'm being recorded, so I'm actually not going to talk about a couple of those things today that I'd planned. But I sit on the board of directors of 3 companies. 2 are overseas, 1 is here, and 1 is an investigation company. And we've been doing really high-end cybercrime investigations for the last 7 years, taking down organized criminal syndicates across the Asia-Pacific region. We've done work for governments across a range of things. So my job with the company is to go over the finances and everything, but I also have a special advisor role of keeping my PIs alive when they go in and do investigations. So I know a lot about cybersecurity because I've been providing legal information, not advice, to criminals of all walks and backgrounds from different parts of the world, to governments around a range of projects, and to businesses around how to increasingly do their cybersecurity. So I've taken this role in Western, and I'll talk a little bit more about the Western perspective in a minute, but I wanted to just start with what I think cybersecurity is. So cybersecurity is the ability to protect and defend the use of cyberspace from cyber attacks. And by cyber, I don't just mean cyberspace, I mean anything that connects to a network. Every appliance in your home, every sensor in the waterways, every component that has some sort of a chip or some sort of processing ability within it. And we're probably up to about several trillion devices that connect at the moment. And cybersecurity is really at its essence. What we don't understand is often cybersecurity gets confused with information security. And information security is about securing the data, right? It's about securing the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the various data and network systems. Actually, I'm going to go forward first. And back up.
I think you skipped over one.
Yeah, I think I did too. That's the one I wanted. Okay. So someone asked me the other day, what keeps me up at night? Cybersecurity doesn't, believe it or not. It doesn't keep me up at night because I know eventually we'll look back in 15 to 20 years and we won't have the same kind of scare in ourselves. But at the moment, we're really at the essence. So when I think about cybersecurity, I think about medical practitioners. If you think about who's in the medical industry, you would think, right, surgeon, paramedics, pharmacists, consulting doctors, family doctor, maybe a veterinarian, a dentist. These are all people in the medical profession. In 10 to 15 years' time, we're going to see the exact same chart with cybersecurity, but at the moment, we tend to think about cybersecurity from 1 or 2 limited perspectives. And even within each of these things, the amount of specialties in medicine would go into the hundreds, if not thousands. Cybersecurity in 15 years' time will be the same, but we're not there yet. One of the things that we're trying to do, and not just at Western, but increasingly at Australian universities across the region, is to explain and to get people to understand that cybersecurity is not a computer science problem, full stop. It involves computer science and networks, but there are so many more other areas that are intricate to protecting cybersecurity. And from a small business perspective, which I'm going to get into later, some of the things you can do, and some of the most important, have nothing to do with technology. So one of our lecturers has put this slide together, because typically when you go anywhere, people talk about cybersecurity and they seem to think about it in terms of red team and blue team. Has anyone heard of that term, red team and blue team? Right? So typically it goes like this: hackers in your system and then the people who defend it. One's a red team, one's a blue team. But that couldn't be any further from the truth. In fact, people learning in those fields will be a small percentage. There are all of these other teams that work in cybersecurity to protect the cybersecurity ecosystem. And that's just as important in a large business as it is with a small and a medium. And if you want me to give you that slide a little bit later, we can. But there's compliance, there's law, there's business, there's psychology, and increasingly political science. Industry tells me they don't want a single computer scientist now in cybersecurity who doesn't understand the geosensitivity of cybersecurity. All of these things are integral to an organization. So we prepared this slide a little bit ago because I was asked to talk about Western's capability in the area of cybersecurity. And I put this together about a year ago at that time. And some universities would have similar kind of components, but what I wanted you to really sort of to get a little bit of understanding is that these are sort of the main areas that are integral to the Western Sydney philosophy of cybersecurity and what we specialize in. And you will see quite quickly that it's quite different as you go forward. And there is a lot of computer science with that, but a lot of it has very little to do with computer science. We've got a couple students here today. I'm not going to point them out because they'll be really embarrassed. But they're finishing up on a new program that we have in cybersecurity and behavior. When we go to industry and we ask industry, and particularly large organizations, what's the #1 problem you have with cybersecurity? Can you guess what it is? Kind of people, but what specific problems with people? Attitude and behavior. So let's say you're to go into the Commonwealth Bank or a large organization. The #1 problem with cybersecurity they have is building a culture of cybersecurity from the janitor to the executive boardroom. And you can't actually have cybersecure practices within your organization unless there's a culture of how to do that. And so that's one of the things that we try to focus on quite a bit. But we have projects running in every single one of these areas at the moment. There are days when I wake up and it's overwhelming because there just aren't enough trained people. The students are going out the door, but the level and the specificity of the skills that are required make it more challenging almost every day. TAFE can produce great people on the tech side of things, but they do nothing on all of the other side of things that is comprehensive to cybersecurity. So in a typical cybersecurity maturity model, you would have organization, you would be unaware, complacent, compliant, you would have risk management, or you would have a cybersecure culture across the organizations. In the last couple of years, we've started to do a lot of work with SMEs, and I've made that really deliberate because I think they're the most vulnerable group in cybersecurity in Australia. And I can't remember what the statistic is, but isn't it something like 70 to 80% of the Australian economy is SMEs? And we're not focusing on it, which just, it seems just crazy to me. And most of the companies are somewhere between aware and complacent. A few medium and small towards the compliance model. But we're really at the basics, okay, with this. I'm going to come back to this later. So often when you go to cybersecurity conferences, everybody will talk about the different products that you can buy. And it's actually overwhelming. If you go to, at the moment, so there's a whole new, how many of you have used a security broker for anything you've done? How many of you have used a mortgage broker? Okay. An insurance broker? There's now cybersecurity brokers in order to help you navigate the 10,000 plus products that come out each and every year to help in the space. It's overwhelming. So if you were an SME to try and integrate cybersecurity into your business model, it would be overwhelming. There are amazing companies within Australia and abroad that are dedicated specifically to helping SMEs with cybersecurity, but it's hard to find and know. So using a cybersecurity broker is one of the best ways forward for you to do those things. And they operate the same as an insurance or a mortgage broker would work. But often you get sold products, but you don't understand the who and the whys in your systems. Now, I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate. I've had some seriously weird experiences happen to me in the last 20 years. I'm going to write a book when I'm done my career, and it's going to be a bestseller because I can't even begin to, if you can guess billionaires that I've given legal information to about cybersecurity, take 10, I've probably given advice to 3 of them on different things. Everybody is a victim of cybersecurity. It doesn't matter how intelligent or how little intelligent, you just lose different amounts of money, right? And billionaires, we had one who lost close to $100 million in a cybersecurity fraud. And it ranges all the way down to, you know, someone having your credit card or stealing your identity. And it goes all the ways in between. So the 4 main groups of people, if you could call it that, in your systems are going to be organized crime, insider threat. This one's a little bit silly because we kind of put it up as dark and white, like in order to do black and white hackers. That actually always gives me a lot of anxiety when I see people characterizing the world of people in your system as black and white, because I've never met a single person in this space who could say the only thing that they've ever done is white hat hacking. It's all shades of gray. And I'll tell you why. The law is very strict on cybercrime and accessing into networks when you're not authorized. And it goes like this. It's actually strict liability. And that means it doesn't matter what your intention is. As soon as you've accessed that system without authorization, you've broken the law. So it's a strict liability offense. And it's that way in most jurisdictions in the world. You would only go up, okay, in terms of if you've manipulated or intruded in a serious way afterwards, but it's actually a strict liability offense. So the ability of any researcher, no matter how altruistic, to have only done white hat hacking, in other words, authorization the whole time, is almost zero. And I've yet to meet someone even at the highest levels that can honestly say that they've only ever done white hat hacking. They've gotten their start usually by breaking into systems. Most of the areas that we deal with, however, are this fuzzy shade of gray, and that's why it's an absolute nightmare to sort of navigate from a legal perspective if you're in this, a startup company in cybersecurity. But it's also a nightmare if you're a business person trying to navigate this. So we're going to talk a little bit. All right, so first of all, we're going to enter into the cybercrime mentality. What is the safest phone and why?
Well, I would say it's an iPhone because Apple spends some time making certain that you can't access aspects of your telephone and the operating system.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a tool called Celebrate that lets you access everything in an Apple now.
There's all sorts of tools, but the question is, what's the safest one at the moment?
Yeah. Who would have a different opinion? So that's certainly a valid opinion. Yeah, yourself?
A dumb phone, not a smartphone,
Okay.
so it doesn't connect to the internet.
Possibly, yeah.
Switched off.
So a dumb phone that doesn't connect to the internet is safest. Okay, right? And so what else?
Switched off.
Switched off, actually, no. You could, even when your phone's switched off, it's still
Buried.
switched off, burn, microwave, deep freeze, yeah.
I think we need to understand what make to think us that why a phone needs to be safe, right? So it's the data, the activities which we do on that. So maybe my friend said that dumb phone because we don't have our sensitive information on that, right? So maybe the phones which do not have our sensitive information on that, or
Well, maybe I should say, what's the safest smartphone?
yeah,
Okay, 2 different things. So, pardon?
None.
Or can be.
Yeah, probably none. But you have to remember that cybercrime is a business, okay? So all of the things that you consider with your startup company or where you consider, they do the exact same things when starting up. So in particular, what kind of a market are they going to want to target? If you're writing malicious software where you want to gain advantage into as many systems as possible to infiltrate and have different ways of making money, what are you going to target?
The largest, so someone like an Android, where most of the phones are that particular.
You're not going to spend months and years on end developing malicious applications for a phone that has no target market. So the Microsoft phone is actually really safe because nobody uses it, right? So most of your applications, if you were to go and have a look, most of them are written for Android. That has the majority of the share. And that's because Android is terrible at cybersecurity, and so it's a double whammy. They have the majority of the market share, but they're not very good at cybersecurity. iPhone, very good at cybersecurity, but they have a really large market, so they're going to spend energy and effort and time. And that's how you have to think if you're a business. Anyone can be approaching and entering your systems, but what you want to do is have those implementations and processes in place to deter 98% of those people. And that's what it's about. It's about making sure that you're not the victim and your neighbor is. I know that's a terrible thing to say, but that is the mentality. And that has been the mentality in Australia, is to try to do what we can to make sure that Australians are less vulnerable than other countries. And that is seriously the mentality. We have an amazing program in Australia. How many of you have ever had an ISP? So you have an ISP connection at home. Have you ever had like a phone call or an email telling you that your machine has been quarantined? Yes? So Australia was the first jurisdiction in the world to make it mandatory within all of their ISPs to, if your machine either was affected, infected, or part of malicious software, or about to become it because they could predict it, they would let you know ahead of time, and they would try to do what's known as a wall garden. So they would send you a notification with different systems and processes to clean your machine up. Now, in order to do that, they actually had to change the law, because it's actually quite illegal for people to be viewing your system and whether or not it's not infected into machines. The program, we don't talk about it a lot, but it was actually very successful, so much so that countries from all over the world came knocking, and it's been implemented across a number of jurisdictions. Fortunately, it's not as safe anymore, because as soon as the people started to realize that's what's happening in Australia, you started to get phone calls from overseas telling you your system was infected. Has anyone had a phone call? And it was actually, not someone trying to clean up your system. It was someone trying to break into your system. Scammers are smart. They're very, very, very smart. And so that's kind of the mentality we have to think about. This is not something that typically SMEs think about either, because they think, well, cybersecurity, it might be someone, or an organized criminal syndicate, or someone who wants to break in my system and steal my data or obtain some money from me. Startups rarely think about their number one asset, and often that asset is actually your trade secret or your intellectual property. Now, the person wanting to get into your system to steal that, and universities are in full crisis mode in Australia. We have had foreign entities in our system for years that we cannot get out, to the point that the Prime Minister's cabinet is now sending in training for all universities, because the situation is out of control. It's after the intellectual property, and these are state governments after that intellectual property for commercial advantage. And you're just as susceptible as an SME as if you were with a large corporation. And in fact, sometimes more susceptible, because often SMEs are sitting on the best, most cutting edge IP. Now, I went to do some training in Canada a long time ago, easily 4 years. And that was right after the terrorist incident that took place in our parliament, where someone came in and shot everyone. And it was known at the time, afterwards they realized that security in parliament buildings around the world, the training was absolutely abysmal for those kind of situations. So they started to get together different parliament security details from around North America mostly, and provide these 1 week intensive trainings. So they invited me to come, and I thought, okay, this is the strangest thing I've ever been invited to do in my life. And I sat in with all of the heads of securities of various senates and parliamentary buildings across North America, and I did all the terrorism training. And so we got access to all of the video footage that's never been on TV. We went through all of these components, and my job when I was there was to do the cybersecurity training. And so they had us do this one incident. It was very disturbing. We had to actually plan a terrorist attack on the building. And so we did the incident, and all I could think afterwards is that this would be so much easier to have the exact same effect if they just did it through cyber. So then we went through and then did it. We realized it would cost us significantly less money. You could all execute it remotely. No one would ever go to jail. Like, the days of thinking that cyber isn't involved in almost every acute incident are gone. What troubled me, though, more was when we did this, I asked afterwards, I said to the head of security at the parliament that was hosting us, I said, describe your role to me. And he said, well, I'm responsible for all the security, cybersecurity, et cetera. And I also am the person who gives all the tools to foreign dignitaries. So if there's a foreign government over, I give the personal tour of the Parliament building. And I said, that's really interesting. I said, can you take me on a typical tour? So he took me on a typical tour and we got back. And I said, now what happens when you get back to your office? Well, he goes, well, they always give me a gift. And I said, okay. And then what else happens? He goes, well, sometimes people want to show me pictures of their family. And I go, okay, and how do they do that? Do they just get their smartphone out? Oh, no, 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 they always stick a USB in my system. And I just went, this is where we're at. The head of securing Parliament in these governments doesn't know not to stick a USB from a foreign dignitary visiting from into this system. And if you go home tonight and just Google USB, disaster, cybersecurity, some of the world's most sensitive incidences have been around this. So I've started the following experiment. I leave USBs every airport I go when I travel all over the world with a message to say to, if you plug this in, please let me know where you are at and where you've plugged in. You can't even believe where these USBs go. They've been like circulating as everybody goes and plugs them into their system and sends me an email back. This is not a cybersecurity culture we've developed. We're at an infantile state at the moment. So curiously, regardless of whether you're government, large industry, small, medium, most cyber intrusions go through a very typical cycle, right? And it doesn't actually matter who's behind the attack or the incident in question. And that cycle goes something like this. Usually they've conducted a little bit of background work, right? So they're not going to just randomly target your organization. There's been a little bit of background work done, and usually this is automated. So this is not someone looking up on Google where you are, et cetera. It's all done by automated components. So in many instances, depending on your definition of artificial intelligence, it is AI enabled, right? So it's really quite quick for an AI bot to go through your LinkedIn. It loves to pick up and sync with any calendars that it can, to see where you're going to be. And the program will deliver back intel on the normal components of an organization's behavior, predominantly through open source. So all information that's open to the public. And then at some point, when they decide that there's a couple companies they want to target, they have to gain access to that information or to that company. And there are a number of ways of gaining access. How could you gain access to your company? If I wanted to infiltrate your network and gain access, how could I do that? I know you're not cybersecurity experts, but I want you to think like a criminal. How could you do that?
Get you to watch a video or something which is, got an infection.
An infection behind it, okay? And someone said social engineering. What's social engineering? So phishing attacks is one of many, and a phishing attack is typically, there are three kinds of phishing attacks. One, it automates to everyone on the planet, and it's actually pretty obvious that it's a phishing attack, but we're seeing less and less and less of that, and far more what's known as spear phishing. So you've got a specific fish in mind that you're targeting to hit. And these are much more difficult to detect because they mimic the behavior of the corporation in which they access. But here's the thing. The reason why this is in the news all the time is because companies have data logs. And so when they have a major incident and they lose $3 million, they're able to go back through the logs in many instances and they can see that it originated with a phishing attack once they do the cyber security audit. But think of all the things in your organization that you never audit. What are those? Phones, right? So we've been conducting research across a number of SMEs and large organizations, and we say, do you think the phone was involved in the attack that you witnessed? And they said, no. But then we asked them, well, how would you know? You have no logs. You're not recording that content in most instances. And probably the easiest way to get access actually isn't through phishing in these emails. It's probably easier to get the information you need through the telephone. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So let's just say you get a foothold within the organization. The golden ticket once you're within that organization is to get control of the systems administrators. So those are the people in your organization that have access to all of your networks, all of the email accounts. It's like the golden ticket of the organization. And so Todd put up that ASD8, the 8 essentials. There are actually 39 components of that ASD essentials, and none of this was written for small to medium business. I'm told AustCyber is going to be producing something for small and medium business because the essential 8, while good in theory, aren't overly practical for small and medium-sized business. But one of the things that you can do is to make sure that you monitor how many people have systems admin access. That actually isn't something you find in the Essential 8, and it's probably the thing you should monitor the most, right? You keep that to as limited the amount that you can in the organization, because that's the golden ticket when someone's trying to break into your system. Once they're in, they then start to, well, it actually depends. If it's ransomware, it's going to disguise itself for a very long time in your system. Okay, can you think of everyone knows what ransomware is? Right, so you get to work one day. I had this happen to me last year when I was at UNSW. Turn my computer on, message pops up, hi, we've taken your system for ransom. You're going to need to pay however many what was the cryptocurrency? Bitcoin by X amount a day. And I thought, oh, great, lovely start to my week. But then I thought, this is a bit amateur looking, right? So I just shut my computer off and turned it back on and it was gone. So it was actually an empty threat, but I thought, these guys are brilliant. They actually, they probably get people paying them, and they actually don't have to have any computer science knowledge at all in order to get a few people to pay money. But increasingly, this is not what has happened with organizations. This is very real. People are only going to pay their ransom if it isn't an empty threat. And it's not an empty threat when you get ransomware components, right? You have to pay or that data is wiped. So typically with ransomware and advanced kind of persistent attacks, they'll want to lie dormant in your system, often through what's known as a rootkit. And that's kind of like putting on an invisibility cloak over top, right? Really hard to find a rootkit in an organization, and most intrusion detection systems only pick up a certain amount of rootkits. So they're hiding out, okay? And they're observing and making notes about your organization so that they can send very specific emails and text messages from your phone later in order to extract very precise amounts from your system. I have yet to see a fraud in a single organization where the amount that was asked for was inappropriate. The amount was specific to the organization and their transactional records. They even knew when there was about to be a trade. They knew when supply chain payments were due. It's highly automated, and that's not just by someone taking notes. That's all automated in your system prior. And it makes it extremely difficult to pick up because it looks so much like what's regularly occurring in your system. And then you get privilege escalation, and then bad stuff starts to happen. Okay. In cybersecurity, an SME is about to be hit probably the most through a supply chain attack. This has been around for a long time, right? Poisoning supply chains, it's a defense term. If you want to kill the army, put poison in the wine, they all go drink it, everybody's dead. But it means something very different in cybersecurity. So in cybersecurity, it means the following. If I am going to try and break into Google, I'm not going to do it through traditional means because I know the security is complex and incredible. If I were to break into Google, I would probably go to the dark market and purchase what's known as a zero-day vulnerability, which I know for Google would, if I was proper for Chrome or something, would probably cost me about 1.5 million on the dark market to buy that, and that would be the easiest way in. But that's not the business model for the other 99.99999% of companies on the planet. They're going to target the SMEs who are in the supply chain. Because often the supply chain, right, one supplier will supply a range of larger companies where they can hack in and get larger payouts at the end of the day. So they poison the supply chain, and we've done a bunch of interviews recently, and in all but one, the payment diversion that went out was through a compromised supply chain. And SMEs are predominantly within that supply chain. So what happens is that they break into one of the supply chains networks, and they get all of that privilege escalation, and they do all these sorts of lovely things. And then they send out regular emails and texts that they would normally do to all the people that they supply in order to gain access into their systems. And the emails that you would receive on the other end are spoofed. They look exactly like an email would if you'd been doing legitimate business. Sometimes they will have created a new entity within the email system. Sometimes they will have just have changed one component. And it's very, very, very difficult to ascertain if you're dealing with a legitimate supplier or someone who's not a legitimate supplier. And it's the thing that is becoming frightening for me, based on the interviews that we've done with industry, is that once industry gets hit once, the largest sum we've seen in Australia go missing is 2.3 million. And they started off with 1,000, 10,000, worked their way up at 100,000, and they thought, we're ready. No one has picked us up. We've just made 3 fraudulent payments. We're now going for the kill. They go in for 2.3 million and they exit. Right? That is really profitable. Doesn't actually require a lot of money to do this. The money that they require later within the organization, what makes it organized crime, is, believe it or not, getting the money and making the fraud isn't complex. It's actually laundering the money is the most complex component in cybercrime. And it's a whole separate field of study. So I'll go through one of the payment diversion frauds that the company that I worked with did. And I've fictionalized components because I don't want you to guess who it is. So it was a large sports equipment company. They did about $100 million a year sales. Actually, we'll go back. Okay. And they followed all of the ASD8. Everything in the organization they followed. They actually follow closer to about 23 of the 39 ASD. This is not a corporation with lax cybersecurity practices in terms of the technical components that they purchased for their systems, but they did not have a culture of cybersecurity within the organization. So the following happened. So they got, there was a normal supply that was about to have to exit and go to a normal supplier within that chain on a certain date. The CEO went to board an airplane at a certain time, and you know how you turn your phones off to, right, to swipe it to an airplane mode? The person at the time had an iPhone 7, and when it was timed perfectly so that when he got on the flight, and that would have all been, you know, swiped off and the flight's taking off, they timed a spoofed text message back to accounting to say, oh my God, I'm just about to leave for this trip. I haven't, you know, made this payment. It's critical for the sale of X. And when you're the person and your CEO sends you that, and you know they're on vacation, and they sent a really specific text telling you, I forgot about that, you're almost always going to make that payment. And that's, you know, increasingly they're getting better and better and better at doing this. And so that payment went out. Fortunately, in this case, we were able to actually seize the money in Hong Kong. So we were lucky that they used a traditional jurisdiction to launder the money. So Singapore and Hong Kong being the 2 money laundering capitals of the planet. Actually, if your money goes there, you have a far greater chance of getting the money back. But what we're starting to see with these payment diversions is they're not using the traditional countries anymore because we're getting too good at seizing the funds. So in the last few that we've looked at, it's gone through Sweden, it's gone to Mexico, it's gone to Brazil, it's gone to the United States, it goes everywhere now. So the skills and the payment diversion is changing. We talked about ransomware already. Okay. One of the things, and I'm just going to go through. I'll go back up. Okay. So one of the things, in the last 2 months, I've been asked to talk about AI-enabled cybercrime. And because companies want something more edgy, so they're like, tell us about AI cybercrime enabled. And I will come and I'll say, look, malicious software is AI enabled, has been for a long time. Every single intrusion detection system you buy is AI enabled. So in that sense, nothing has changed, it's not novel. But we talked about some of the ways in which things are becoming more automated. That is slightly more AI enabled, but it's not in its truest definition. Until about 2 weeks ago. Do you want to know what's happening now with these payment diversion frauds? They're able to mimic the voices of your managers and your CEOs of your corporation. So 2 months ago, this was not a serious threat. It's now the threat because the payment diversion fraud has moved into that level. So Australian businesses are still figuring out how to patch and how to configure Microsoft 3.6. Honestly, half the time, payment diversion or ransomware it happens because Microsoft 3 isn't configured properly to the network. This is not a hard fix. This is a super easy fix. But that's not done correctly, and this happens. So we have patching not occurring, all of those ASD8 not occurring. And yeah, it'll keep the low-grade people down, but it's never going to keep the next vector and threat out of your organization. There is no product in the world that does it. There is no product in the world that will ever do it. You would have to have a dedicated cybersecurity team within your IT team, and most organizations only have an IT team, none of whom are trained in cybersecurity. I think that's going to change. I think every business on the planet in the next 15 years will have bespoke cybersecurity people within their organization, no matter what it is they're practicing or peddling. But that's where we're at. You can't actually protect yourself from someone that's AI-enabled calling you on a phone that's spoofed from their regular phone, and it sounds exactly like your manager. How are you going to protect against that? I don't know, but that's the new wave that we're hitting. So we talked a little bit about what does an organized criminal syndicate look like in cybercrime? It looks like a tech company. Seriously, it has all the same capabilities as a tech company if you walk in. And I know because I've interviewed a whole slew of Eastern European cyber criminals. I've done legal work for some of them. It's very interesting. The psychology behind who commits crimes is far more complex than the media ever reports. We've arrested people and they just sit. This one guy in the Philippines, we finally got arrested, and he just sat down and he said, "Oh, it's about time. I was expecting you to come for me at least 5 years ago. I can't believe I've been getting away with this nonsense for 5 years." He was relieved to be arrested, right? And I said, well, and this is someone who is educated at Cambridge University. And we said, why are you doing like what you're doing? So he had defrauded Australians out of about $100 million through gambling software. And he said, it's fun. To him, like if I were to equate what drove him, it wasn't about the money. He didn't even live a lifestyle that warranted the money that he made. It was a game to him. It was like clearing different levels of a flippin' video game. He wanted to see how much more he could defraud, and he wanted to see how much more he could defraud out of more sophisticated players. And he got really, really, really good at it. But at the end of the day, he was just relieved not to be doing it anymore. And so, yeah, this is the mentality. It's not always what you think it is behind the scenes. Some of the people in the Eastern European countries, they said, look, there's no actual legitimate employment for me. I am graduated from the Moscow Institution of Mathematics. This is one of the best institutes in the world for mathematics. And if he or she were to leave Moscow, they would be commanding salaries starting at 300,000 US their first day out the door. There isn't or wasn't that kind of work at the time in many of those countries. And it's interesting as an organization because if I had to recruit my next wave of trainers, I would head to 3 countries, all of them with really strong cybercrime records because the skills are off the chart. The Ukraine produces the best people. The skills are off the chart when you go there and you hire. It's crazy, but you have that trust factor. But if I hire someone from the Ukraine and they've supplemented their career up into now trying to legitimate work, but also doing other work because that's the way that they could use their skill set to gain money, can you trust them if you bring them here afterwards in employment? And that's the game, right? The whole trust in the governance and the components. We'll go forward a little bit more. So what actually can you do? I mean, this is not rocket science, okay? Each of these is difficult, but they're all things an organization can do. The first is education and awareness. So it's not enough. In fact, we played this game. PwC has developed this game for cybersecurity that they take in order to educate their executive board members of some of Australia's biggest countries. And it's a fairly simplistic game, and basically it works like this. There's an object if you're a criminal, and nation state actor, organized crime, hacktivist, or random person in basement trying to get into system because it's fun. They have these objectives, and then you have to defend, but you have a limited budget. And so as you're defending against the network, you quickly blow through your budget, and then they were able to see that if they only spent X amount of money in cybersecurity, how the thing they were trying to protect because they ran out of money would be solved. So it's all in an effort really to get CEOs to be a bit more aware of the budget, et cetera, et cetera. Now those kind of education programs are really important. The ones around phishing are really important too. But being with psychologists and neuroscientists for the last year, I've learned the following. You can educate and train and it will help, but the human brain is one of the most complicated things on the planet. And no education or training is ever going to eliminate the behavioral factor in cybersecurity. It doesn't matter how much training you do, you're only ever going to get up to an acceptable level of, or a percentage. So they call them now, certain people within organizations, the largest organizations now do highly individualized training in cybersecurity, and they were able to identify the people in the company most likely to pose the biggest cybersecurity risk. And I worked on a capability with an intelligence agency on identifying insider threats before you hire people based on different metrics and whatnot. So it's fairly sophisticated. It actually, if you look at the people that are the most likely to click and not follow through patterns, you actually can't train them through the cycles. They've been put through 4, 5, 6, 7, 20 different programs, and they still come out and they're vulnerable. So the question of the organization is, what do you do? Do you fire them? Because they're a serious liability to your organization. Some people would, some people wouldn't. What they do now is those people actually aren't allowed to make any decisions in their job. So you actually can't educate and train your way out of all cybersecurity problems, full stop. So how do computer scientists in Silicon Valley see this? Well, they see it as the following. The only way to get human behavior down to an acceptable amount is to remove humans from the equation altogether. And AI, everything has to be super AI enabled. I don't think that's a realistic possibility because there's always, you could get into that philosophical argument. At some point, there's always a human involved. Planning and preparation, this one is important. How many of you have a plan, 1 or 2 pages, of what you're going to do when you get hit by ransomware next year? Do you have that plan? The plan isn't complex. The plan goes like this. If we get hit by ransomware, who's the first person we call? Who's the first person you call?
SMEs, but
Pardon?
I don't think SMEs.
There are some amazing SMEs that in New South Wales and Sydney in particular set up, cybersecurity SMEs, set up to help other SMEs. They're affordable. It's $10,000 a year for you to get this help that you need. It's a silly investment not to have it because when something like that happens to your system, and we know it will, you phone them and they help you out instantly. So the thing you wouldn't know from an organization is that depending on the variant of the ransomware, there's actually companies that have certain variants decrypted, and that's their key intellectual property, that's all they do. You can actually pay the same amount for the ransom, or you can pay the same amount to decrypt and unlock your ransom, and then the ransomware threat goes away. But that's a business decision. But having that discussion, what you're actually going to do if that's the case, I mean, those are 2 things that should be decided before you get hit by ransomware. The third is, does your cyber insurance cover ransomware? Do you have cyber insurance? Do you have an incident response plan? Even a 1-page incident response plan that just has who's in charge of what if something goes wrong and who you call will be enough to get you out of water 80% of the time. But in the absence of that, it's really difficult. Worst people to call, your IT person. Because there's this weird belief that if you're in IT, that you know everything about cybersecurity, and it's like going to the GP to have neurosurgery. I can't express that enough. Yeah, You're going to get the reference from your IT person of where you need to go if they're a good IT person, but they're not able to do a number of things. Even thinking about, do we turn the data off to our companies? So a lot of times we see people will actually phone their law firm when they get hit first. Lawyers advising on technical, how silly is that? Okay, it's like if you were to ask me a super technical question, I'm not going to give you any advice today. I have no specialty in that. But lawyers usually the first port of call, and they always tell you to turn your data tap off. And that's terrible advice if your whole business model is based on an application, a cloud service, or a website, right? But knowing how you would react in a couple of scenarios is a good way of doing this. Ransomware is hitting every single city council in the US as we speak. It's spreading from one to the other. It's going to happen here in the next 6 months. We're not prepared. Companies are not prepared, and it's going to hit. So if you go take one thing, go home, and at least prepare a one-pager on how you're going to deal with the ransomware that's likely to hit your system. We're going to actually offer a workshop in the next month on how to deal with ransomware. Detection and recovery, yeah, you still have to buy some security products. You need intrusion detection systems on your, you can't get around that. You have to budget for that. Use a security broker. Sharing and collaboration. Technically, you're meant to call your certs when these things happen, and the certification authority is someone in Canberra that's meant to be giving advice to any company or organization being hit in Australia. And you should, and I agree with it, except for that I've heard horror stories of companies calling and not actually getting the advice in a timely manner that they actually need to respond to the incident. Because they're overwhelmed. That's how many cyber attacks are happening. So you're far better off to engage with a private vendor, in my opinion, now to know who you're going to call and what budget you've allocated in order to do that, because chances are good the government's not going to be able to help you out in a timely manner, especially if you're an SME. Third thing you can do is band together with us and other SMEs. Instead of everybody going and writing a policy, a cyber incident management policy, figure it out together and share your resources, right? Lots of industries share resources. Cyber is one of those that has to be shared. Last but not least, ethics and certification. If you want to spend money with your employees on training, send your IT person to go and get a certification every year in cybersecurity so that they understand one more piece in the puzzle, okay, at a detailed enough level that they could actually respond in a meaningful way. And I'll finish up soon.
I've got a first question that came up when Todd was speaking, and in Vietnam they teach code in year 1. If we're truly to be cyber smart, is there an age we could start teaching our children at, say, year 1 about cyber bullying and try to make it into something, so you reckon?
It is year 3. It's mandatory curriculum across every school in Australia. Year 3, they do coding. They start with coding.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So is there any benefit? Okay, your point answered.
Yeah.
It does bring in a wider conversation about, you know, what it's a fascinating what you put in curriculum and what gets left out. At the moment in Australia, it's just so busy. What do you put in and what do you put out? We're working with the Department of Education to work in some cybersecurity courses for year 10, but that'll be non-mandatory. But at least it's something. I know in other countries, data analytics starts earlier and later. You know, where does it finish and stop?
Yeah, and I've just reviewed the curriculum. That'll be rolling out in AI, all sorts of cyber components, cybersecurity in year 8. So they're cycling for year 8, but they're all electives within accelerated STEM programs.
I went to a run this morning. It must have been an AI bot or something on my podcast came up, and it was about cyber warfare. And I was really interested. I was terrified by what they were talking about. And my question is whether or not this is such a big problem, but it's actually a role for government. It's not actually a role for, because they were talking about, you know, governments actually bringing down banks overseas, and the governments are actually the ones with the viruses. How on earth can a little SME protect itself against something that is actually you're talking about businesses. Every business is going to have a cybersecurity expert. Well, that's actually a threat to trade and business for an entire economy.
Well, there would be layers of cybersecurity. So having one person, that would be the person that dialogue with the food chain up in order to produce a cybersecurity ecosystem. But you're right, the government has to step in and do more. But I would say even more so, government actually isn't as equipped as some of the large firms in Australia. They actually have to step up and do more to protect the ecosystem.
A large firm is just, and the grid, they were explaining the grid is actually a private sector grid, it's not.
It's a private sector grid.
So why would they actually bond? Because they're just making money, so, but, yeah, it just struck me as a huge issue. And particularly if universities are getting hacked, I mean, that's their educational institutions. Surely, yeah, it's a defence department job to be protecting us against this.
It's everyone's job. That's the whole point of today. It's actually everyone's job. It's something that permeates every single facet of society. People are just slowly realizing this. But yes, defense is an important role.
Sovereign risk is so important from a cyber perspective because, you know, there's been examples in the last 5 years about how you disrupt society and erode trust in sort of the foundations of, you know, your political and government structures. That's at a whole different level. That's cyber as well. Now, you're right, but it's got to be, to Alana's point, everyone's got to be involved in it because it's just huge.
I don't know, I have a question for you, especially about, you mentioned the SME is about 70 to 80%, and this is true. My question is, the knowledge gap is huge, and where I go for a conversation with the business owners, they invest with something to return on investment, but when you talk about security, nah, it's not gonna happen to us, and they're gonna invest with something they cannot see
Yeah.
a return on investment.
So this is the saddest thing. Every single interview that we did, the company said afterwards, well, now that we've been hit once, we won't hit again. They don't understand the vector changes, like quickly. They're already in ANI-enabled, you know, voice commands now. So they're preparing to patch their system for a problem from 2005. So they've been hit with something from 2005. And they're not preparing for this cycle that's happening now. And I would say that's been the single saddest thing to learn as we went through and did some of these interviews. I don't have an answer for that, but I am meeting with a couple of organizations to try and address this. I don't know how we get the message out in a way that's meaningful, because humans are fundamentally willfully blind, right? Like even though if you tell someone that you ride a motorbike, that there's X amount of chance of you breaking every bone in your body, we still ride the motorbike. Right? And you can think of a million different examples where that's human brain neuroscience, and often people don't stop until they get hit or a payment goes out. But here the scary part is once they're hit, they think they're now immune from ever being victim again in the future. So for me, it's a double whammy. I actually don't know what the answer to that is, other than when we were in Silicon Valley, we had someone come and tell us they'll fund our research. But we'd have to partner with a small company in the US that helps to secure all of the supply chain for the US defense. And it was remarkable because it was mostly done through contracts and telephones. So there's a company in the US, if you're going to do any kind of supplying for government or defense, like their due process is unreal. I would say we're at step 2 for 150 things they would do with their due process. So those kind of things could be implemented, I think, on a trial level for industries or that are particularly vulnerable. And when you think defense, that's one that comes up. But you have to have a celebration around what you're doing that's good. And at the moment in Australia, we don't really celebrate what we do well in this field.
Except for New South Wales, which is the best in everything.
Well, actually, we've actually been the poorest at advocating our position in cybersecurity, which is why the network got up, and Victoria was the best. Now, I know...
But do they have a different focus? Victoria's about data sets, having clean data.
No, they'll tell you they're the best at everything in cybersecurity.
Okay.
So will Queensland. You know, it's a bit of a game at the end of the day. Todd's slides were actually realistic. We actually are really good at the things he said.
So my derivative question for Todd about this specific thing is that the big enterprises, they follow the compliance. They need to be compliant, you know, following frameworks.
Yeah.
But the SME, how we can help them to enforce that to be compliant in their business. For
mean, it's a very, very good point that you bring up, because as an SME, you haven't got much money, and then you've got the compliance and regulation, which is always, you know, gee whiz, now I've got to comply with this. I do like the idea that Alana had about pooling resources. I don't think there's anything wrong if a couple of businesses went and sort of sourced an application and then could roll it out in their companies. I mean, it's money for jam for vendors who are saying, buy my product for $20,000. Well, you know, maybe it doesn't have to be that much as well if a group of people went and shared the same application. So I like that approach to SMEs and getting that, because my friend owns a pub, and they had the Nigerian hackers and held up and he just paid it. It was $2,000, and he said, oh, that's what me and my friends just do. But you could have used that $2,000 not to get held up, and then your tills would have worked for a day.
I'll tell you some stories, because I work in this industry, and I work in one of the vendors, American vendors for cybersecurity, and you'd be surprised if I share the stories around even the small budget, around 300, 500, that the businesses, they justify not to spend just to protect their environment.
Yes. Whereas in other parts of the world, the CEO is actually personally liable for damages up to like millions if they're responsible for poor risk management decisions around cybersecurity. That's not the case here yet.
Todd, if I could just throw in one question there. As you know, I was with the government, and we used to have a lot of programs that were specifically directed towards SMEs and growing businesses and what have you. Cybersecurity has obviously been recognised by the government as being a significant issue right now, because you're sitting there running a division. Alana's obviously looking at the Western Sydney University perspective, and I suspect all other universities are doing the same thing. My question is that if it's that important, is there any likelihood of government support for assisting SMEs to address this problem? Now, I'm not suggesting you throw, you know, millions of dollars at it, but you know, as the point was made earlier, I mean, the cost of getting involved for an SME to try and get effective cybersecurity protection is very, very high. So is the government going to consider this, do you think, at any time?
Look, that's a very good question.
I didn't want to put you on the spot, by the way.
No, thanks for that, John. I appreciate that. And I think government doesn't know. I mean, it's such a nebulous area. I mean, say you get hacked, and then it goes to a legal issue. Well, where does it? Do you sue the server that's in, you know, Mexico, or you know, then you get caught in that international law? It's just, I don't actually think anyone actually really knows. But flipping that, what can you do when government working? I like the idea of getting together over an issue and lobbying government for funding over something. For example, why wouldn't Western Sydney approach government for Industry 4.0 and cybersecurity around that, and use that as a competitive advantage? I know I'm hammering the point here, but it's that'll be easy for government to understand and to do something on, because it's really a lot of these forums, people say government should come in and give us a framework and sort of make sure that we're doing the right thing and we don't know what to comply against. And I think the answer is it doesn't know itself. So just to flip that about how government can actually work with people doing things, look at that a little bit differently.
And I'm suggesting an approach that if a group got together and approached the government, there would be some sort of collaboration to come up with some or system, some way to come up with a solution.
Oh,
we'll give it a try first, haven't we, Rick?
Give it a try. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's been done. But it's better to, I just don't think there's any country or area, there is some standouts about how the government is helping businesses. I mean, the whole Israel thing's interesting. They've come about it from a different way, but I don't think there's a country to say, look, here's the framework, this is how SMEs need to comply, this is the cost, and this is how it all works. I don't think that exists yet.
That does in Estonia.
Estonia.
Estonia's cybersecurity market was born out of the fact that when they left the Soviet Union, they put all of their marbles in one basket, and that was to become the most cyber-enabled nation in the world. So they moved all of their government services completely, where you couldn't even go into a venue to get something, all in cyber. And they were attacked by the Russian in what's known as the first instance of cyber war. It nearly bankrupted the nation, but what happened is that they learned how to respond and it didn't bankrupt them. And between them and Israel, they're now actually the world's leading provider in cybersecurity services. I wouldn't say the actual technologies in every instance, but they have implemented programs down to every single level of organization in Estonia because they realized how vulnerable they were by connecting all the infrastructure. And they do all sorts of advisory work for the Australian government around these things.
So does government have any plans for compliance and audit on cybersecurity?
I don't think so.
Well, certain industries are already audited for cybersecurity, predominantly security, brokers, and finance. So that's fairly new legislation. But SMEs, I mean, typically here's the following. You actually get exempted by a lot of the acts if you're doing less than $3 million a year turnover. So small entities in Australia are almost exempt from privacy, security, a whole range of components. So compliance actually is not going to be a motivating fact unless you changed all the legislation. A motivating fact might be you get the following tax break if you send an employee to do the following training, and maybe there's specific training, not training like this, because today I've just disseminated some information. That's actually not training. Has to be a workshop. So yeah, so we're going to be running a ransomware workshop, and Cisco and IBM are going to come in. We've got about 5 organizations that are going to give us their time, and they're going to come in, and we're actually going to shop with SMEs coming in exactly how you prepare for ransomware. Really specific, basic things, even down to something as silly as configuring your network. Because we're finding that those skills in organizations are lacking at the most fundamental level. So a workshop that explained how to do that would be fantastic. And if you got a tax incentive on top of that, I think that is the better way to do it than it is through compliance.
Month or so, or what's the time have you got on?
I have to find some time to organize it. Todd and I have discussed it, and we think it's a good idea, as well as other members of the team. And
Perhaps you let us know through Launchpad, and we circulate the details to all our.
yeah, and so I think those kind of workshops have to happen, and it needs to be large industry coming in to do the training. And people that have been a victim to this. So I'm hoping I can get someone from the city of Baltimore who's been defending against that ransomware attack to come over and talk about all the things that did and didn't work well. Yeah.
Just for a small business, like the likes of Norton and Kaspersky and those standard virus, is that still recommended, or is it just a waste of time?
Well, you still have to secure your firewall. And most of those systems have moved more towards intrusion detection systems that are not purely firewall applications. So yeah, you still have to buy that. It's not like you could just buy one product and it covers everything. Though those companies are starting to move towards those models of more comprehensive things other than just your firewall. And I know McAfee is definitely moving in that direction. I think Symantec, Sophos, they would all be doing that. It wouldn't just be a firewall component at this point.
Going back a step, going back a step, I mean, the federal government is actually funding insurance on acts of terror. Now, cyber terrorism is similar. If the insurance companies were able, if the government underwrote some sort of scheme that, because, you know, businesses have all risks insurance policies, and shouldn't cyber attacks, if they could be covered, and the government, and it would, I don't know, am I being made it too simple? Or?
The whole cyber insurance is fascinating. I met with a cyber insurance company yesterday. It's hard to, I think my sense is they're just coming up with numbers at the moment. It's hard to define actually what it is, and then therefore how much your data is worth, timesing that to the power of lost time in your business. Yeah. There's a whole lot of factors, and I've seen some numbers. You know, it could be this amount all the way up to Y amount. So that's a lot of work's going on in that area at the moment.
It would depend on the vulnerability also, wouldn't it? I mean, that would be
that as well,
a major component in terms of the pricing.
So there is a success story there. There's an Australian company that's just been funded $300 million venture capital because they have the best actuarial model in cyber insurance. But they've moved the company from Melbourne over to Silicon Valley.
Gentleman at the back. Yeah.
I was just wondering, the threat that changing the culture of the company is difficult and challenging do you deal with an insider who's, they got a USB stick and simply penetrates? How do you deal with that? How do you monitor that? Only takes one person.
There's ways of monitoring it. I mean, that's what data access logs are for. You're meant to review those. So they might be doing something normal within their organization, but usually insider threats, if you look at the literature, they escalate. So they try to get into systems they don't have access to normally.
Surprisingly, the Australian government has recently published their space policy. In that, it mentioned that the company which want to establish in Australia should be compliance with the cyber security and should be audited if you want to set up a company in Australia. Do you have any comment on that? Why it is so strict on that?
Why they are? Because they're getting hammered.
Government is so strict on having the company to have a compliance and auditor to set up a company in Australia.
Yeah.
Well, that's not for any
And,
SME.
the space policy.
Oh, space.
Yeah.
Well, you're sitting on national security. You'd expect a minimal, there'd be a slight audit. We actually have projects running in space right now in cybersecurity.
In the space policy, they have written that recently they have published that
Yes.
there should be compliance and audited.
But here's what's funny. So they're going to set the standards for space at one level, but they probably won't set the same standards for the person who supplies defense with their toilet paper. And the reality is it's just as equal of a threat to go in through the toilet paper company as it is from the space one.
Yeah, so then the people may go to New Zealand where there's no such law.
Well, they won't be supplying though without it. The point is that we haven't touched upon this, but your actual contracts with your supplier are really important. You should be having standards in there, that things they have to comply with. They have to provide you with audits. Otherwise, they just don't do business with you. And there are a lot of companies that are starting to move to that model. The largest retailers in Australia have moved to that model.
Gentleman in the front here.
Into other industry
Yeah.
also.
Thanks, Joe.
I would appreciate your view on what I observe is that cybersecurity professionals or the industry segment in a way differentiates itself with the IT security. However, information security like data encryption, masking, endpoint security, and firewalls, all a part of IT, is very much a part of the vehicles that the cybersecurity needs to use. So my question is, why is it being made mutually disjoint? Should it not be a gradually extending or expanding approach?
I think to that point, it's organisations situationally have approached that differently. I mean, I personally don't see there any problem to have those skills disseminated into a number of different areas instead of just being in the IT department, like we've talked about before. I personally don't get too hung up about headings, but it's the skills that people provide. There needs to be delineation, who is actually responsible for that task at the end of the day within the organisation. But how you set up your groups and teams is very important within the organisation. So, I think the fit is there that cyber goes within the IT department, but it doesn't have to be like that.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be exclusively restricted to or privilege of IT, but IT should not be excluded from it, is what I'm saying.
One of the
I would never argue in a million years that IT should be excluded. I just think the mentality is that people still perceive cybersecurity only as an IT problem. And that in and of itself is a problem.
Well, there is some examples about cyber being in the HR area because, it's an organisational transformation. It's a culture piece as well. It's also technical, but depends on how the business is set up.
Yeah.
I've got 3 questions. I'm not sure whether they're sublime to the ridiculous, but so I'll start with perhaps the simplest, which was your example of the security manager who put the USB stick into his device.
From a foreign dignitary.
Of course, but this is, I think, important. A, was it connected to anything? The computer, it may not have been.
And if he was smart, it wouldn't have been. But he would have then captured all the data and whatever material was on that USB stick, if there was any infection there, he would have got it and they could have examined it. Which leads us to the next question, particularly if it comes from Canada, because there's a lady, probably still incarcerated, who's the daughter of the Huawei gentleman. And we hear the top end problem of the security, do not use Huawei because they may have hidden code inside their hardware in order to utilise that for their purposes of cybersecurity. Two questions. One is, what makes anybody think that the Americans wouldn't do the same thing? And then how come we don't get real? And that it would be smart, in fact, to get one of those devices so that we can actually examine it and understand it and maybe even capture them at the problem. Or there may be no problem. That all supposes knowledge of everybody. So there's a lot of thinking, but there also has to be some knowing. How does that fit? Is it from the sublime to the ridiculous? Is it possible to disconnect from some form of the network and be separate to at least give yourself some elements of safety?
It's a loaded question.
No,
And
well, I didn't mean it to be loaded.
Well, no, it just is because I can't actually answer one of the questions truthfully because I'm not allowed to comment. The only thing I can say, large technology companies are under pressure from all of their governments everywhere on the planet to do all of the things that you just said about Huawei. Full stop. That pressure is there from everywhere. There are about 6 or 7 nations that have genuine cyber offensive abilities. Australia is one. I'll stop there. Separating something from your network, of course, there's a million different ways you can set up your networks that some are quarantined and compromised, but that's actually a business decision that gets made within the model. In this case, the person didn't know if his computer was set up that way before he put the USB in, right? Had they have known at the time, then putting the USB would have been fine. But you're assuming that the tools that they have would have uncovered whatever was installed on the machine through the USB, which is a mistake to be made.
I wasn't making the assumption. I was hoping they had it.
Yeah, and third, I mean, I was in Singapore last year. I don't know, some of you work at tech companies. Microsoft's cybercrime division out of Singapore is bigger than any federal police or local police cybercrime division almost in any nation other than maybe 2 that I can think of. They can see infections happening in real time to the second on every device connected to a Microsoft Nintendo or whatever the Microsoft component is, all of their email accounts, and it looks like Minority Report when you go in. The intelligence they have is down to the second. It's not like some random thing of putting your USB in. They have better intelligence than governance in many instances on how this works, which is why you can't actually fight these problems without them on your side and cooperating with you.
We've got time, I think, for one last question before we break for some networking lunch. Anybody the last question? Is that it?
Well, I was going to add one.
Not loaded one.
Because you've identified a particularly important attribute that Microsoft and Google have, which is the ability to examine things in real time, which require huge resources. So that leads, and this is the reason I'm asking this, is because it's to do with email security. And in the company that I work with, we are having some of those issues at the present moment. But that there is the implication that one should work with those organisations that can afford to do the sort of analysis that is required in order to protect the businesses from the very simple malicious intrusions, which is via the email. And the example that you've given of CEOs being rung up and asked to be made payments is a classic example of how often it happens. We probably don't know how often it happens. Is there a correlation between simple email service providers and going for the big ones?
If you don't need to use email in your organization, you shouldn't. for one of the organizations I work with, we don't communicate ever through email. It's all done through a very secure app. And it's the only one that hasn't been knowingly compromised. And it's not because we require security, it's just the safest way to do business. And because there's only 8 of us, there's no real reason for us to engage in email ever. Right? It's only 8. So as a small business, you have some advantages. As a medium-sized business, you could engage in Proton Mail. That will take out almost 99% of these risks that come through. Because again, the business model is targeting, you have to have something where you're going to get the certain amount of click-through rate. So if you're targeting Microsoft or Gmail, you know you're going to have that. But if you were to go to an obscure organization to solve your email dilemmas, you're probably not going to have the same, I guess, vulnerabilities at the end of the day.
I think we have to stop it there. We're going to have some networking afterwards.
It's not a question, just a comment that I come from a technical background, technical engineering, and email is based on SMTP protocol, simple mail transfer protocol, and with the email we have 18 layers of checking. So if this is another out of scope discussion, but if it is a business decision to use email, you have to secure it.
You have to secure it, yeah. But it's a business decision at the end of the day.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your attendance. Alana and Tom, much appreciated. Terrific talk.
Thanks, John.
Most enlightening. And we'll all be talking, no doubt, more about cybersecurity in the future. Alana, if you could let us have information once you get your head around that workshop, I'll get it all circulated out.
Sure, that would be great. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Tom. I invite you now to
In the mid-90s.
we've got some lunch organised here, so if you want to sit around and have a sandwich with us and do some networking, feel free. Thank you very much indeed.